Richard, we've got a question from you. You're the first person to ask a question. Would you like to jump on and ask your initial question?
Oh, excellent. Yeah, so just a question out of the gate there about the variability of different renewable gas feedstocks and their associated emissions profiles. Would we be planning to record those different emissions as part of the attributes, depending on feedstock?
I think the key thing there is where is the feedstock coming from? I mean, if this is, irrespective of what the feedstock is, if it's going to essentially be being, otherwise left to rot and emitting its carbon to atmosphere, then I don't think you need to worry too much about the makeup of it. If, on the other hand, you are looking at biomass that isn't just waste, then yes, you probably will need to look at accounting for that, because you start to get into all of the issues of, biomass that is being grown that would compete with food crops and all of that sort of stuff. But we've generally been looking at sort of waste type products, be that out of the forestry sector or out of the agricultural sector and so on, and of course municipal waste.
And just to add, the assessment of the feedstocks will be part of the production device verification process, just to understand how it is that the production facility produces renewable gases. And so that information will be captured. Whether it's deemed to be an additional attribute or not, provided it has value to users of a certificate, it can be included in some way in the informational package. Ian's point, there may emerge differentiation of value between different feedstocks, even within classifications of renewable. At that point in time, it may be worth establishing an attribute for differentiation upon those dimensions.
Cool. Okay. Thanks. Thanks, Tim, and thanks, Ian.
Richard, you've got another question.
Oh yeah, the other one was in relation to how the system might interface with the ETS as that develops over time. Is there any thought into how the two systems would I guess cooperate?
That's a great question. I'm not sure we have a full and complete answer for you. In the first instance, it's worth just mentioning explicitly that this is a voluntary system. And so effectively, it would operate outside the realm of the ETS. It is a proper seeking product to market and provide a value to that marketplace dependent upon what it can provide to the purchaser. The second part of your question was in relation to pricing. And so I'll touch on that really quickly as well. Effectively, the price of a renewable gas certificate we would expect will be determined by the counterparties in the trade. And so if one of the reasons that a purchaser is seeking to procure a renewable gas certificate is because they're trying to decarbonise, and one of the problems with their organisational emissions profile may be associated cost, then we would expect that the value of an NZU would be a relevant input into the price and value of a renewable gas certificate. But we also expect that there is a potential that other factors may come into play over and above that. The key point there is that it's a bilateral agreement, and so subject to a number of market forces.
Cool, thanks, Tim.
We have a question from Kostan. Do you mind introducing yourself really quickly and asking us that question for start?
Yeah, certainly. So my name's Costin Banos. I work in the Green Power program in Australia. We're a national program run through the state governments, and we're sort of looking into renewable natural gas as a logical pathway, because currently we're just electricity. So my question is, will each participating generator require a life cycle analysis to determine the embedded emissions of that particular feedstock?
And in short, we have no decision made at this point in time to require that. Very keen to hear if that's something that people would like to see. However, the focus at this point in time is understanding the nature of the production process itself. There is a process we will need to undergo to look at classification of feedstocks and process of verification, and we may end up at this point, but we haven't specifically got that far as yet.
Yep, great. Thanks, Tim.
We have a question from Tim Street. Tim, do you want to quickly ask us your question?
Sure. I'm relatively new to the gas industry. This might be a question for Ian. Is it always safe to assume that 1 extra megawatt hour of biogas will always offset fossil gas, or could it actually offset some other form of biogas?
Thanks, Tim. Look, certainly at the moment that's the case. If we ever got to the stage where the existing gas fields were in massive decline, and there had been an awful lot of biogas production coming to market, then you might start to approach the situation where biogas facilities are competing with each other to actually get their product into the pipeline or to the end user. However, I think because of the nominations type system that runs with the pipeline, that will tend to take care of itself, because if people are procuring gas from biogas facilities, then those facilities will be nominating the gas into the pipeline. And that what that effectively means is the people who are buying biogas at the other end are receiving the energy equivalent of the biogas that has been injected. All right, so it's not about when I was talking before about biogas effectively displacing fossil gas. That is true in the current sense, but if you had a situation where the pipeline was entirely transporting biogas, then obviously that's no longer a true statement. So it's going to change over time, but you're always going to be in the position where, as long as the producer that you're buying from is injecting the volume of gas that you are purchasing, then the whole thing works.
Thank you.
Yeah, hi, Tim and Ian. Thanks for this. Ian, you were talking about interconnection requirements with transmission pipelines. What about distribution systems? If this is connected to a distribution network, what's your thoughts on how that would work?
Well, you'd have to have exactly the same requirement that a green gas producer only injects spec gas. I mean, that's a requirement under the the gas safety and measurement regulations, and there is no exemption for that. So before you allowed somebody to directly inject into a distribution network, you would have to obviously arrange some certification of that. And actually, I guess the other thing you'd have to arrange is making sure that it was odorized.
Yes. All right. Thank you for that, Ian.
That's
but
right.
in essence, you're saying that this is something that distribution networks, your expectation would be distribution networks would kind of have the contracts and processes to facilitate those outcomes. Because I guess I don't think distribution networks do currently.
No, I don't think they're geared up for accepting gas generally. But I think that is a development that would have to occur, and it does seem to me that it's the distributors that are best placed to manage that. You wouldn't want something in the certification to be doing that, because it's an agreement between parties who neither of whom actually owns or controls the distribution network.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Alrighty. Ish, I wonder, just I see a question down the bottom there, Tim, from Len Howes about impurities. Do you want to take that while we're at it?
Feel free.
So, Len, do you want to, if Tim turns your microphone on, do you want to ask your question for the...
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep, good as gold.
All right. No, it's a random question. I wasn't expecting it to necessarily be answered right now, but seeing as you've given me the opportunity, the question really just was trying to recognise that gas is used in things other than combustion, and that often impurities that may not matter when you burn gas actually might be quite critical from a process point of view. So just trying to understand really what the quality assurances around the biogas that would ensure that material doesn't come in that's actually going to make processes unsafe.
Sure, and I think the key thing there is making sure that the gas meets spec in terms of its composition, those things are set out in the spec. So you would expect anybody using gas for chemical processes from a shared network would obviously be expecting spec gas, and so they should be able to handle it. I think your point is particularly appropriate where somebody is making a connection to a green gas producer directly rather than via a shared network, because that type of connection isn't actually required to be spec gas. As far as the gas safety and measurement regs are concerned, it just has to be safe. So I think that would be pretty much handled as between the buyer and seller. But to the extent that you might expect the buyer would want certification as to the greenness, then you probably would actually specify what the constituents of the gas were as part of the whole attribution process.
Can I just maybe just quickly ask the question then in relation to gas back at the injection point into a shared system. Because my understanding at the moment is that you're actually required to inject to meet the gas spec. You can't rely on the system to actually even it out. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Yep. Each injector should, well, I was going to say should be. No, must inject spec gas. And if they discover that they're not, they either have to put it right straight away or stop injecting.
So I suppose my point is that a lot of the biogas type things are probably not going to meet the gas spec, are they? Particularly on things like Wobbe index.
Well, I guess that's why we say biogas as such probably won't and will need to be cleaned up. So that, I mean, if you get to something that is mostly methane, I think you probably are going to meet the gas spec. But yeah, I mean, biogas in the raw sense, but by the time you look at the water content and the CO2 content and so on, it could be a country mile away from spec. So you wouldn't want to be doing that. I am aware in the UK there, you'll find this on the Scotia Gas Network's website. They do have some digesters, well, actually, sorry, they don't own them. I think they get the gas from them. There are digesters around the country that take animal manure and process that into biogas. And then they use a propane that SGN calls propanization, which is obviously adding propane to the mix to bring up the CV to spec. And then they take that into their local distribution system. Now, that seemed to be a rather brief explanation to me when I read it on their website, because I thought there's probably more to it than just chucking in a bit of propane. I'm sure they must have to dry it up a bit and do more to it. But that is probably a property of the digestion process. One of the post-processing bits of equipment that's there would be my guess.
So can I just maybe finish this conversation a little bit? I'm just thinking about gas standard. You mentioned NZS 5042 there. Obviously, you're aware that First Gas are looking at hydrogen trials. I mean, you guys are looking at potential biomethane. Is there some sort of coordination likely between parties to redesign the gas spec for the future?
Ooh. Probably desirable, but that is always a thorny issue. I mean, from in the early days of Gas Industry Co, there was a review as to whether the gas spec should be altered. There were some end users that were quite keen to see the spec tightened up in terms of things like Wobbe and so on. And while I could understand, the benefits to those end users, it would have put quite a lot of cost onto the producers, and wasn't, necessarily a general good. But I think the other thing to keep in mind is there's a whole raft of consumer appliances out there that expect the current gas spec. Now, sure, they would work with a tighter gas spec, but depending on how you modified it, you might start to run into problems with some consumer appliances.
Yeah, but you mentioned that there's no problem injecting gas in the current gas system if it was hydrogen. But I'm pretty sure there's a hydrogen spec on the current gas system that would limit quite extensively the amount you can put in. So presumably, in terms of planning to blend more hydrogen in the gas, it would need to be reviewed anyway, wouldn't it?
So I might just jump in real quick, Ian. So we are
not directly involved in the delivery of any underlying gas products, which I think is just a relevant point around this conversation. So really what we see is a logical role for renewable gases in the decarbonisation of our collective industries, and the ability for a certificate product to increase the attractiveness of some of these production methods. So certification, where gas production is happening, some of that gas production may or may not be injected into pipelines under a range of requirements. Then the ability for issuance and transfer of certificates can take place. The role of the certificate really is to enable a producer to communicate all those attributes / characteristics. And Len, I do note you've got a question on some of those attributes, which I might ask if we can come back to at the end of the slides. But really it's about communication of some of those attributes that aren't immediately recognisable through the molecular transfer. So aspects of ownership, age, etc. Some of those things are the things that certification really relate to. Do note that there'll be a range of questions around how New Zealand can actually transfer hydrogen, biomethane, other things, but that's not really in our remit right now.
So specification, not an attribute?
Not directly.
You talk about renewable gas, and I think you mentioned biomethane and green hydrogen as one. But I'm just wondering whether the concept wasn't actually wider than renewable gas. You're actually talking about zero emission gas, and whether that might not also include things like bio-LPG, hydrogen with carbon capture and usage and sequestration, or even the turquoise hydrogen, which is appearing at the moment, which effectively is not a renewable gas, but it doesn't actually have any CO2 emissions associated with it. Is this a renewable energy gas scheme, or is it a zero carbon gas scheme?
Let me have first crack, Ian. It's in some ways you can consider it just as a gas certification system. You have a question around attributes. Really quickly, if we think about the key attributes, there are things like age, location, ownership, and then effectively its production method, any inputs to that production itself, as opposed to fundamentally the construction of the production process, but the operation of the production process, and therefore subsequently, what responsible emissions would a consumer of that gas have? So really we start to be able to say, you can verify anything, and what the certification process will do is make sure that those components are accurate and able to be transferred. And then the question comes, does that particular production type, is it able to be achieved here in New Zealand? Does it have a marketplace in New Zealand? And if so, how is that value transfer enabled? Is there a direct connection perspective between a seller and a buyer? Or is there in fact a disconnection physically between someone who wants to buy that gas type and it's the seller of that gas type? And if so, can certification play a role in enabling that transfer?
Okay. The other question really was just around the market. How will the certificates be valued? Is it kind of going to be very closely linked to the ETS scheme, or are you seeing some other mechanism for setting price?
So really quickly, great question. The value of the certificate and subsequently the price of the certificate is going to be fully determined by the market. So there will be a bilateral agreement effectively. The producer of a gas product will have the ability to issue a certificate against their gas production. If they do so, they will have a view on what they will be able to get for that certificate in an open marketplace, and they will be able to go to a potential buyer and negotiate a price for it. There is a correlation we would expect between effectively the work that a purchaser of a certificate would be able to do with that certificate, and that fundamentally is correlated to decarbonising their own operations. So if you look at their ability to do that via the purchase of a gas certificate or via the subsequent purchase of a carbon credit, there is a correlation there between that work, and so therefore in terms of a conceptual price floor for a renewable gas certificate or a zero carbon gas certificate, you would expect that it's linked to the price of an NZU, for example. However, if a production facility has some form of social co-benefit, for example, perhaps it's creating jobs for the local community, something like that, and if there is a buyer in the marketplace who wishes to recognise and communicate their role in enabling that to take place, then we would see the potential for the seller of that certificate to get that recognised in the certificate price. And so really it becomes quite a flexible instrument for premium production methods to be valued appropriately.
So given that it's certificates capture the attributes of the gas, then presumably those attributes might change, and the mechanism for selling it on the market is more likely to be bilateral rather than traded as a commodity, isn't it?
Most likely, definitely in the short term.
Yeah. Okay. So I suppose my last question really was, I mean, you're putting a lot of work into setting this up, but it kind of feels to me like it's quite early on in the piece. I'm not really seeing much happening in terms of actual need for these certificates at the moment. So what do you see as a time frame for actually these gas certificates to be needed?
I would expect that as soon as there is renewable gas available, significant renewable gas available in the marketplace, there will be buyers for renewable gas certificates, and therefore buyers who will be willing to return additional proceeds to the producers of renewable gas.
No, I understand that, but when do you think that's likely to be?
I think a key thing will be when is biomethane able to be accepted into a pipeline. And I think that's a timeline that we'll follow quite closely.
Thanks.
Well, I think, Tim, it's probably worth thinking about other possibilities. I mean, we've got a wastewater treatment plant in Hamilton that makes quite extensive use of the methane that they produce. They've got an energy centre, so they do a bit of electricity generation and so on. They could well be interested in certifying their plant to help with their carbon accounting. I mean, here in Wellington, we've got the the Nova generating plant at the Southern Landfill. Again, they might want to, well, I suppose that's possibly more that they might want to certify their electricity as green, but I think there are off-pipeline possibilities that might actually want to use the certification system ahead of stuff being injected into the shared system.